I assume the arguers in this case actually mean whether or not the fetus should be endowed with the same rights as a sapient, independent human being. I just wish I could intervene in all of these arguments if I had the energy to go in and point out the fact that whether or not it's a human is semantics until you can really define what's the moral basis of giving them rights.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I've decided to wade into another highly polarized topic, the morality of abortion. This has become a hot political topic in the U.S. with Republicans stacking the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. In many people's opinion, this was a large step on the way to Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, where women's rights to self-determination are overridden by making them subservient to the greater rights of their unborn progeny. The debate over this topic is a question of ethics, and ethics is a philosophical topic that I'm very interested in, not an expert, but I'd like to kind of give an overview of the academic thinking on morality and how it applies to abortion. And as I say, as a caveat, I'm not an expert here, but if you would like to hear my opinion, I would love to share it with you. So please stay tuned and enjoy this discussion. If you do like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app. I really love it when you share the love, and come give me your comments on my Facebook group, The Rational View. So for most of us, morality is what we're taught as a child, what we're brought up in, and falls in line with our feelings of right and wrong. And if we've been, well brought up by caring parents and perhaps have had exposure to some sort of religion, that we feel that we have a very good sense of right and wrong. And this forms our moral basis. We have feelings of repugnance at certain behaviors or even lifestyle choices. And these often are learned or taught to us through social mores that we're exposed to from our peers or from our parents. Now, many cultures actually believe that there are objective moral values that exist across societies. Murder, theft, lying are consistently seen as morally wrong or evil behaviors. Some things are objectively bad and some are objectively good. Many will claim, however, that their morality is based on an absolute code handed down by God, for example, in the Ten Commandments. The idea that objective moral values can exist in the absence of God is actually a hotly debated topic. And philosophical circles, as well as on the internet, especially. How can atheists have any morality if they don't have God to tell them what's right and wrong? You can't have an objective morality, some will say. Now, I don't prescribe to that belief at all. So where does the truth lie? I'm not going to tell you what the truth is. What I'm going to tell you is what the opinions are out there and the reasoning behind them, and I'll let you bring your own conclusions to the table. So how is it that God can give us objective moral values? How is it that the Bible and God represents a personality who defines good and evil according to his or her arbitrary value structure? So this is basically like you are being handed it down from an all-powerful being that has defined values. They have a defined value structure that we may not know of, and they have revealed these truths as moral. The moral relativists out there suggest there's no way to call one thing good and another thing evil in an objective way. There's no way from bridging the gap between is and ought without bringing in some arbitrary valuation metric. And that's typically derived from our social upbringing. So some people will say morals are all relative. And in some, societies, honor, killing for honor is good. And some other societies, killing is always bad. So we have these different opinions on whether there are objective moralities. There are obviously some people that will say there are always objectively good and objectively evil acts, but I don't know if we would have universal agreement on that. So, objectively good acts, one could say, derive from true altruism. In other words, where there is no expected benefit to the person doing the good to someone else. So improving someone else's station with no expectation of good, without even being recognized, doing it completely anonymously, can be considered objectively good. Objectively evil acts may be those that benefit the actor at the expense of another. And could you build up an entire moral code from just these two definitions? Well, that's a problem. There's always gray areas where it's very difficult to say if people are really acting from altruism or if they're acting good based on the possibility that they might benefit from it, that they might grow a reputation, or that they might be observed, or that they're trying to prevent being caught. Are these actually objectively good acts then? So it's an interesting discussion. Is this a job for the rational view? Can we claim a rational basis for morality, or does it need to be subjective? Or does it need to be derived from objective laws handed down from a value code invented by a greater power? So first, I'd like to address those that claim the Bible provides an objective moral code. We can read the 10 Commandments, and this seems very black and white. But then there are people that say, well, the Old Testament doesn't hold anymore because of the good news of the New Testament. So all of because in the Old Testament, there was the 10 Commandments, but there was also a lot of laws. There was books and books of laws. And these were all, there was like eye for an eye, tooth for tooth kind of stuff. There was a lot of killing and slavery and a lot of really bad stuff, really. And so a lot of people kind of say, well, the Old Testament isn't really a good moral character. The New Testament is a much better moral judge, and the golden rule is kind of the defining character of the New Testament. In other words, you do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So, but what I want to address is there an objective basis? Could the Bible contain an objective moral code? And over the centuries, the Bible has been used to argue for and against slavery, for and against women's rights, and against a whole range of things that aren't seen as morally wrong by those who claim to follow its teaching, such as eating pork or wearing clothing of mixed fibers. In my opinion, the interpretation of the Bible rests in the eye of the reader, and this has changed over the centuries and millennia. And each person brings their own interpretations to it. And that's why we have so many different religions, so many different versions of Christianity, and so many cults that claim that their interpretation is the correct one, and they want to hold their moral authority as supreme. What is moral law and what is allegory? But wait, someone may say, there is a correct interpretation, isn't there? That we have the Roman Catholic Church set up originally by the original Christians, and the Pope is the final inspired witness to the Word of God. So papal decrees are always providing the divine viewpoint. Well, if you go into the doctrine of the Church, everything the Pope says isn't infallible. In fact, they've discussed this, and they said only ex cathedra decrees are infallible, and all the rest should be respected, but could be wrong. So even the Pope ain't quite sure what is true and what's not in his church. And in fact, even representatives of the church have difficulty figuring out which pronunciations of the Pope are supposed to be divinely inspired as infallible. There's no a priori way to tell. And this gives the church a way out as well in case something they've said becomes contradicted by general opinion in the future. And feel free to go research it. There's a list of something like 7 documents that are generally accepted as infallible, but we have no way to know. And the church reserves the right to change that. So all in all, that's just my saying, is there doesn't seem to be an objective moral truth that you can derive even from the Bible. So let's go to logic then, which is maybe a more objective way to look at things. What are some attempts to derive a universal moral code? Well, the simplest code you could maybe think of is something like the Golden Rule from the Bible. There are good ideas in there. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Now, this is very simple. Just treat people as you would want to be treated. And this seems to be a very good moral compass. Maybe this doesn't lay down universal laws for everyone, though, because some folks want to be treated differently. How would you apply this to the fraught question of abortion? Obviously, if you were a woman that was concerned with your health or did not want to take your child to term for some safety reason, or the fact that you couldn't raise the child properly, would you want to be allowed to have an abortion? Or conversely, try to put yourself in the place of the fetus. Would you want to have been aborted? Obviously, as a fetus, you have no conception of that concept and would not be able to express a preference. So in applying the Golden Rule, now one must decide if the potential future being that the entity represents has any rights. And this, I think, is really what the abortion debate boils down to from an objective perspective or a logical perspective, is what are the rights? What moral obligation do we have to a fetus as opposed to the woman carrying the fetus? Do the living have a responsibility to actualize future human lives? Well, there are, as I said, different moral codes out there, and I tried to outline a simple one based on the Golden Rule, but there are whole schools of philosophy discussing this. And one is called consequentialism. That's a big word. Consequentialists define the morality of any set of actions by their outcomes. So the consequences of an action determine whether it was moral or not. And that seems right. But then that doesn't really tell us how to decide something. So there are different types of consequentialists. A preference utilitarian, again, big terms here. A preference utilitarian would argue that the consequences we should promote are those which satisfy the wishes or preferences of the maximum number of beings who have preferences. That seems like a reasonable basis for morality, doesn't it? You want to satisfy the maximum number of people. The good of the many outweighs the good of the few. Can we make a consequentialist argument about abortion? In this case, it would just fall to the number of lives saved by making the abortion. Are there more lives saved by making the abortion or not? And sometimes it's 1-to-1. Here, however, is an example of why consequentialism sometimes breaks down and doesn't form maybe the best basis of morality. And for you and I, we have, for everyone, they have some feeling of what is moral. Would you consider it ethical, for example, to take someone against their will, kill them, harvest their organs in order to save the lives of 5 people or 6 or some other arbitrary number? Most people would say no. Right? That doesn't seem right. However, you're saving 5 lives at the expense of 1. This is kind of the trolley problem. Is it okay to kill someone to save many others? If it can be demonstrated this will maximize happiness all around and more people will have their preference if this happens. Ethicists would argue that the right not to be killed outweighs the right to be saved by a medical intervention. And that's interesting. But it seems true, doesn't it? And this is where people say, oh, well, there's objective moral things. Is this just something we've learned, or is this an objective moral truth? I find that very interesting. But going back to the topic, why is there such a controversy over whether an unborn fetus deserves the right to life? On what moral basis does the controversy arise? One would think that saving or actualizing the life of a few cells in a womb is less important than saving the life of the existing mother, or giving the mother the right to choose whether or not she wants to contribute to it. I mean, by law, you can think about, there's a lot of legal precedents out there that tries to enshrine our moral values in the law. And, nobody is obligated to expend energy or endanger themselves or even expend energy. Like, you don't need to try to save a drowning person by law. You're typically not required, although there is some controversy over that. So the question is, how much requirement is there on a woman for something that's just a few cells, not even an actual drowning person, right? A drowning person, obviously, you would think would have more rights than a few cells in a womb that require this intervention from the woman. Well, the church is at the center of this controversy. The Roman Catholic Church regards even abortions necessary to save the life of the pregnant woman as illicit, since it's forbidden to kill one innocent human being in order to save the life of another. But here we get into the fact that, well, wait a minute, the fetus isn't the same as a person. It's not a full human being. Sure, it has the genetics of a human and could someday become a human being, but it's not a fully fledged human being with all of the faculties and understanding. So I went around looking for some good discussions on this, and the Hastings Center website has a really good discussion on this. I'm going to quote from their website. A central philosophical question in the abortion debate concerns the moral status of the embryo and fetus. If the fetus is a person with the same right to life as any human being who has been born, it would seem that very few, if any, abortions could be justified, because it's not morally permissible to kill children because they are unwanted or illegitimate or even disabled. However, the morality of abortion is not settled so straightforwardly. Even if one accepts the argument that the fetus is a person, it does not automatically follow that it has a right to the use of the pregnant woman's body. Thus, the morality of abortion depends not only on the moral status of the fetus, but also on whether the pregnant woman has an obligation to continue to gestate the fetus. So I think it's a moral gray area in a lot of cases. There are arguments on either side. Some conservative groups, such as the Catholic Church, consider the fetus to be a human being with full moral rights, even earlier than the beginning of pregnancy, which occurs when the embryo implants in the uterus. The Church regards the embryo as a full human being from conception, the joining of the sperm and the egg. And this is because at conception, the embryo receives its own unique genetic code distinct from that of its mother or father. Therefore, Catholic doctrine regards conception, not implantation, as the beginning of the life of a human being. Now, this seems like a semantic argument to me. And I don't know what part of the Bible discusses genetics as being the basis for life. It seems like an arbitrary decision by the church, as I'm very certain that genetics isn't discussed in the Bible, unless the Pope has made an ex cathedra statement about genetics, which I'm not 100% sure on, but I somewhat doubt. I'm a little uncertain as to where this idea comes from, that a couple of cells, gametes, and put together as a zygote, should have the full rights of a human being. So there are some people have commented on this. Don Marquis in 1989 argued, Abortion is wrong for the same reason that killing anyone is wrong, namely that killing deprives its victim of a valuable future, what he calls a future like ours. Now, Jeff McMahon denies this, arguing that what we are, when we say we, as in living humans, what are we? We are essentially embodied minds. Consciousness is something to do with our mind. And it's not just the organism or the cells. It's the human mind that makes us what we are. And on McMahon's view, our lives do not start until our organism becomes conscious. And he says probably sometime in the second trimester, which I think is arguable. Early abortion, in his view, does not kill someone with a future like ours, but rather prevents that individual from coming into existence in much the same way as contraception does. And this comes down to a favorite topic of mine, is how do you define consciousness? What is the consciousness of a fetus in the womb? It's a very basic animalistic type of sentience. And there's a difference between sentience and sapience. Sentience is experience and awareness of sensations, right? It's just a non-thinking experiential viewpoint, really. Whereas sapience is realizing that I am me and being able to reason rationally and be sapient of my own existence, and making the ability to make plans for the future and to be aware of my own potential death. These are much more complex topics that don't occur in fetuses. So Marianne Warren argues that biological humanity is neither necessary nor sufficient for personhood and a right to life. She argues that basing moral standing on species membership is arbitrary, and maintains that it's the killing of quote-unquote persons, not humans, that is wrong. Persons are beings with certain psychological traits, including sentience, consciousness, the capacity for rational thought, and the ability to use language. So sapience, rather than sentience, is where we should draw the line at moral personhood rights. Judith Thompson maintains that whether a woman has a moral obligation to allow a fetus to remain in her body is a separate question from whether the fetus is a person with a right to life, and depends instead on the amount of sacrifice or burden it imposes on the woman. Also a valid point. Margaret Little argues that while abortion is not murder, neither is it necessarily moral. A pregnant woman and her fetus are not strangers. She is biologically its mother, which provides her with some reason to protect its life. However, she may have duties of care to others, such as her existing children, which would be more difficult to fulfill if she has another child. So the typical abortion patient is already a mother, single, low income, or poor. Abortion does not necessarily conflict with respect for human life in this case. Many women regard bringing a child into the world when they're not able to care for it properly as itself disrespectful of human life. And this, of course, is where the golden rule becomes fuzzy, because many of us have different interpretations about what would be respectful and disrespectful in this case. The moderate agrees with the classic liberal that an early fetus, much less a one-celled zygote, is not a person, but agrees with the conservative that the late gestation fetus merits some moral concern because it is virtually identical to a born infant. Thus, the moderate thinks that early abortions are morally better than late ones, and that the reasons for having one should be stronger as the pregnancy progresses. So, that was a really cool bunch of statements from that website, and provides a lot of reasons or a lot of grist to think on. What is a logical moral basis? I mean, my logical moral basis would be to do no harm to sapient beings, to respect the rights of sapient beings as you would yourself. I mean, some people would say sentience is more important, but then that opens it up to giving animals and, just about anything with an animalistic sentience the same rights as a human, which I don't think is something that I am ready to do anyways. So is there a moral value that would make us want to protect sentience? I'm not sure. Sapience, I think, is truly rare in the world and maybe in the universe, and is, that ability to act rationally and reason. And to me, it's morally repugnant to kill another sapient being. Under which morality then do fetuses qualify? If you're applying a sieve of sapience, then fetuses are not sapient. And there are certainly questions as to whether or not they're even sentient. But wait, is this a fully consistent basis on which to derive a morality? Under this code, babies aren't really sapient yet. You don't reason until you reach a certain age. You don't take on the adult reasoning until a certain age. So, most of us would argue that killing children is morally repugnant, but this moral basis doesn't support that. So how would you protect the rights of sapient beings not to be infringed and still create a moral framework that is logical? Well, one could argue that killing a baby is a crime against its parents, who have obviously put a lot of effort into raising this child. But then it's more like a property crime, if anything, and that doesn't sit really well with me. The drawback to that is that most would find it morally repugnant to kill babies that don't have parents that would be damaged. So I think we believe that once a person is at the point where they are independently living, that they have some right to protection morally, that they have now enough has been invested in them that they are independent, shall we say, and that they should then apprehend a potential for a sapient life in the future. One should also understand the obligations that the Catholic moral code might place on us. If we're trying to view it as a logical basis, under what moral basis do potentially sapient entities deserve the right to life over existing sapient entities? If they have not yet become sapient, what support do they deserve? What level, how much effort should be put into preserving their possible future sapience? Is it just the conditions or our ability to support them? It seems like this, if we believe that potentially sapient cellular biota deserve our support in the rights of full humans, it seems that this would open the door to a form of slavery of the living to hordes of single-celled overlords. Women would become breeding tanks, and men would be obligated to impregnate as many as possible. Society would be morally obligated to bring all of the frozen embryos from clinics, of couples trying to reproduce to term. Society would be morally obligated to populate the solar system and beyond, taking on a kind of manifest destiny and colonialism of interstellar space to ensure that population growth goes exponentially, and all of these potential lives are brought to fruition. I don't think that's morally great. I think that brings in a lot of questions. Obviously, obligating women to bring children to term is a kind of Handmaid's Tale slavery. Does the moral code, does an arbitrary and objective moral code relate to the amount of support needed, either voluntarily or involuntarily, to bring about the sapient condition? Nobody's obligated to donate a kidney to save a life of an already sapient person. Nobody is obligated to jump in a lake to save a drowning person. Under what moral code are women forced to spend months to bring a fetus to term while in extreme cases endangering their very lives. What if, for example, we discover a drug that would make monkeys sapient, have them reason like us? Are we morally obligated to give it under this moral code to all monkeys? Now, maybe this is reductio ad absurdum of the argument, but I think it bears questioning what, when giving out moral authority to single-celled, non-thinking beings. And then also, I think, this is something that I've been considering in the framework of artificial intelligence and, sentience and sapience being questions we have difficulty applying to large language models, but, we have no real understanding of where sentience and sapience arise from. And I think a couple of years ago, if someone would ask if artificial intelligence models could pass a Turing test, they would say no. So there's a lot of questions, and I'm not bringing you answers, unfortunately, but I am trying to lay out the groundwork of logical thinking so that you can reach your own conclusions on these things while considering the arguments that have been put forward. And I think as part of this, we should examine law. And in the US, Roe versus Wade was the main case that legalized abortion back in 1973. The fetus is not a legal person until it is medically viable without the support of the mother. And I think that's a kind of a reasonable position. That is a very centrist, moderate interpretation of all of these moral arguments. In the law, the state's interest in protecting potential life becomes compelling and trumps the woman's right to privacy only after the fetus becomes viable, which in 1973 was somewhere between 24 and 28 weeks. Today, some premature infants are being saved as early as 22 weeks. However, it appears that absent development of an artificial placenta, 22 weeks represents an absolute lower limit on viability. Some legislatures would claim that because a fetus responds to painful stimuli at only 20 weeks, or maybe even 17 weeks, it is sentient and therefore deserves protection under the law. But I think as I've argued, the rights of the sapient woman to not putting out excessive or not endangering themselves or being obligated to use their bodies as a breeding factory may trump the right of a group of cells that have not yet reached the point of sapience. Now, this is everyone's choice, of course. I'll admit to not being an expert on the topic of morality and ethics, and I'm hoping to perhaps get some interviews to follow this up, but I'm constantly frustrated that online many arguments seem to devolve into semantics about whether or not the fetus is a human being. People are arguing past each other at this point, right? They are not arguing the moral bases of why a human being should be given particular rights over the person that is gestating them. I assume the arguers in this case actually mean whether or not the fetus should be endowed with the same rights as a sapient, independent human being. And these are I just wish I could intervene in all of these arguments if I had the energy to go in and point out the fact that whether or not it's a human is semantics until you can really define what's the moral basis of giving them rights. What is, under what framework do you believe that this human has the right to obligate this other human to bring it to fruition? Where do the rights of the fetus and the mother lie? I would really be excited to hear your viewpoints. I hope that I haven't offended anyone in this very difficult and polarizing topic. I think I've been very fair in laying out the arguments, but maybe my bias is showing a little bit. on this discussion. So if you have comments you'd like to make on this podcast episode, I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group. And please correct me where I'm wrong. I'm open to be corrected and open to hear your arguments as well and your opinions. Thank you so much for listening.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.